I want to congratulate you and We the World on the 20th anniversary of 11 days of global unity. Together, you, me, and we can create a better world and have fun doing it.
Welcome to the 11 Days of Global Unity Summit, featuring visionary leaders and activists working for people and the planet, and a world that works for all. 20 years ago, We the World and global partners launched 11 Days of Global Unity, September 11th to September 21st, the UN International Day of Peace. Since then, 11 Days has become a worldwide platform with 11 campaigns for change, linking local awareness and action campaigns into an inspiring international movement. To learn more and take action with We the World, please go to we.net. This year, to celebrate the 20th anniversary of 11 Days of Global Unity, we are featuring extended conversations with global leaders like Dr. Jane Goodall, and today with Dr. Riane Eisler, plus summit panels on each of the 11 summit themes, which range from unity to environment to human rights, freedom, and peace. For the full 11 days summit schedule, you can register for free by going to we.net and 11daysofglobalunity.org. 11 is a numeral. You can watch replays of all the recordings, and you can also make a contribution to support We the World by going to we.net. Thank you. So before we bring on Dr. Riane Eisler, I also want to acknowledge some of our amazing partners who we support and collaborate with during 11 Days of Global Unity and all year round. The UN International Day of Peace NGO Committee, the UN Summit of the Future, the Unite for Peace Coalition, which includes Unity Earth, Peace Week, the Sign Network, One World, We the World, the Deep and Rapid Transformation Convergence at Cathedral St. John the Divine, Pause the World in Times Square, and Pace e Bene Nonviolence Campaign and March. What an amazing movement representing literally millions of people working to achieve global unity, all working with We the World and the We campaign at we.net. So today, I am so excited that we will be joined by Dr. Riane Eisler. Dr. Riane Eisler is a social systems scientist, cultural historian, futurist, and attorney whose research, writing, and speaking have transformed the lives of people worldwide. She is internationally known for her bestseller, The Chalice and the Blade, Our History, Our Future, now in 57 US printings and 27 foreign editions. She is also an advisory board member of We the World and has been a longtime ally and partner with We the World. In fact, she was an honorary co-chair of the launch of 11 Days of Global Unity in 2004, along with Dr. Jane Goodall and Deepak Chopra. And 20 years later, thank you so much for helping to celebrate the 20th anniversary of 11 Days of Global Unity. Welcome to the broadcast, Dr. Riane Eisler.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Rick. It is wonderful to be with you again to celebrate this 20th anniversary. And I congratulate you on the progress that you've made. Well, I was at the launch, as you said, and
Yeah.
20 years later, this just continues to influence and to move us all towards peace on earth.
We're here still doing it. Right? so, so I have a couple of ideas of like topics and questions, especially things that I'm concerned about. So maybe I'll mention the first one, which is the societal consequences of some politicians normalizing an us versus them culture of intolerance in order to gain political power. For example, when some politicians characterize immigrants as being largely dangerous, which is not true, these politicians are able to use their political support to pass legislation that most people don't want and is against the interests of the same people that vote for these politicians, like legislation rolling back the rights of women to make their own health decisions and rolling back the rights of LGBTQ people, teachers, educators, and even legislation rolling back people's voting rights. This, for me, this is minority rule in which politicians, usually with the support of big money special interests, pass laws that go against the interests of large majorities of people. So, Riane, could you talk about the societal effects of this us versus them culture? Thanks.
Well, I can talk about it both personally and in terms of my research and my writing and my activism. I experienced this in-group versus out-group action as a child refugee from the Nazis with my parents. From one day to the next, from being this cute little girl that people patted on the head, my parents and I became hunted with license to kill. And it was really by a miracle that we escaped. Now, these traumatic experiences led me to questions that my research many years later reported in first in The Chalice and the Blade and then in many other books. But the questions were, does it have to be this way? Because, we're told that there is no alternative, whether it's the story of original sin or it's the story of selfish genes. It's actually the same story, isn't it? We're bad. We have to be rigidly controlled from the top, as God-fearing, right? And this in-group versus out-group thinking, I found out through my research, is actually built into the configuration of the domination system. And this was astonishing to me because I kept seeing these configurations, not only of the domination system, but of an alternative of what I, for lack of a term, called the partnership system. And it's really a partnership domination social scale. And as you move on this scale towards partnership from domination, or the other way, from partnership to domination, you have very, very different results. And this system of classifications, by the way, as you know, Rick, transcends right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern, capitalist, socialist, all categories that really we inherited, if we think about it, from more rigid, authoritarian, rigidly male dominated, because you mentioned women, and that's how gender is organized is a key part of the systems, either a partnership or a domination system, as you'll see. What I saw was first that there was a long period in our prehistory when actually our direction was more in the partnership direction. And you have stories that contradict that, of course, like the caveman cartoon, right? I mean, we're so brainwashed to think that there is no alternative. And this starts really in our childhood, in our families, where we think nothing of showing this cartoon to children before their brains are fully formed, before much less their critical faculties. And what is it really, the message of this cartoon? In the one hand, he's got a club, a weapon. With the other, he's dragging a woman by the hair. Gender. So what is the message? That violence, war, that's just human nature. And so is the idea that through force, actually, it's very interesting, men are to dominate and brutalize, really, women. And that's a false story. And you know very well that my first book, The Chalice and the Blade, really talks about that heritage, but then it goes much further to present times. And my later books have dealt much more with present times and with what we can do to change this. But to answer your question directly, of course, this shift profoundly affected us all. The shift in our prehistory from a partnership direction, societies like Çatalhöyük in Turkey, for example, for 1,000 years. It's 6,000 years old, this settlement. But for 1,000 years, there are no signs of destruction through warfare. Moreover, as the archaeologist Ian Hodder writes, there are no signs that being born female or male made any difference in one's status or wealth. And yes, these were generally more egalitarian societies. And of course, then there was a shift, and there are many theories about how it happened, but one theory is that it was through Indo-European invasions, and that certainly seems to have been the case, at least in Eastern Europe, starting with invasions of Indo-European tribes, nomads bringing with them their domination system. And yes, the use of technology of destruction. And DNA studies, by the way, verify these findings now, which are very, very interesting, isn't it? That we are learning that today. But the purpose of my work and the purpose of your work, Rick, is not to go back to any good old days in the past, but we know the configuration we have to build. See, the old categories don't tell us what we have to build. I mean, there have been repressive, regressive, violent societies in every one of our old categories. Think of the Taliban or fundamentalist Iran, religious, Eastern right, or the rightist fundamentalist alliance in the United States, a mix of secular and religious. Think of Hitler's Germany, Nazi Germany. I came out of that. They spent a lot of energy and a lot of resources in subordinating women. So the consequences for women, I mean, women in Nazi Germany, by the way, and this is not publicized because we're all taught to marginalize, like these categories do, women and children, the majority of humanity. Isn't that interesting? And my work doesn't. My work is a whole systems approach. And we can build cultures of peace once we take into account the entire social system. And I've introduced, and this is a long answer, but I'm going to stop in a minute, 4 cornerstones that we need short-term tactics. We have to put out the fires, but we also need long-term strategies. And these have to focus on 4 cornerstones of all societies, regardless of whether they orient to domination or partnership. Our job is to shift those cornerstones from domination to partnership. And then we have foundations for cultures of peace and partnership. And the first cornerstone is childhood and family, which is left out, isn't it, of the conventional categories, or just marginalized, very important. We know from neuroscience. My latest book, as you know, is Nurturing Our Humanity, and it came out with Oxford University Press in 2019. And it gives the evidence of neuroscience that this whole argument, fragmenting our consciousness again, and yes, in-group versus out-group, us against them again, the whole thing, nature versus nurture, or nurture versus nature, it's a red herring. It's both. It's the interaction of both. Anyway, the second cornerstone is gender. And we have, and they're all interconnected, because if we learn that the female form is inferior to the male form, which is another cornerstone of domination systems, think about it. The Taliban, Khomeini's Iran, rightist fundamentalist alliance, politicians, who preach this, Hitler's Germany, Stalin's former USSR, it's not a question of right versus left either. They all rest on that. Why? Because that ranking teaches us to equate difference, not just sexual difference, which has a huge, stories like Eve and Pandora blaming women for all of man's ills, right? These are false stories, but they're very appropriate for domination systems that we've inherited, okay? So I'm being nonlinear here, but if you also look at this ranking of male over female and the rigid gender stereotypes that are typical of all of these societies, by the way, despite the evidence, despite all of these women who are today leading, which is a taboo, in domination societies, except if you, like Margaret Thatcher, for example, show that you're tough as nails, much tougher than the toughest of men, right? Or you inherit it, like Aquino in the Philippines, etc. But it also, men are doing fathering, like mothering, like diapering babies, like feeding babies. I mean, we have but caring is not a gendered quality. It is coded feminine and devalued in the societies and in the value systems we have inherited. And that leads me to economics, and I'm almost through here. Because economic systems, whether they're capitalist or socialist, have both perpetuated, because they came out of the 1700s and the 1800s. And really today we're in the 21st century post-industrial era. So what they would be really not functional as operating systems on that ground alone, that they're just simply, we have moved to different technologies, but they're also not functional because both of them, both Smith and Marx, perpetuated this gendered system of values where there's always money for prisons, the punitive male head of household, right? Or for wars, the hero as warrior. But somehow there isn't enough money for feeding children, for nurturing children, for whatever is coded feminine. Okay, this is a gendered system of values. We have to unpack it and leave it behind. And finally, of course, and I've emphasized this, story and language. We need new social categories if we are to create cultures of peace, because only as we move from domination, from that configuration to the partnership configuration, can we really have peace. And this is where this in-group versus out-group thinking and acting, the societies that have moved more towards the partnership end today are, of course, Nordic nations like Finland, Sweden, Norway. And you know that they invest more, a larger percentage of their GDP in helping people through NGOs at the other end of the world, people to whom they are not genetically related. That is what happens. As you move more towards partnership, you become we, and you recognize our interconnection.
And I'm very struck by this idea of changing the story, because that was like the last cornerstone that you mentioned about story. And it's so interesting that humanity had a different story, like what you were talking about with the culture where the archaeologists didn't even find any evidence of war for an extended period of time. That's amazing, right? Because the story has become, of course, humanity is always going to be at war, but that's a different story. So, it's so important. I mean, this, changing the story. I mean, do we need, bigger and better publicity teams that work on changing that story on social media and all media, right? What do you think?
Absolutely, we do. And we need to help people connect the dots. Because,
Exactly.
as I alluded to, really, there is a connection, a link between family violence, that punitive family, and, look, Putin, for example, who invaded Russia, who's a dictator, who's always being macho and all of that. He recognized that link by lowering the penalty for family violence in Russia.
Wow.
In 2018, that law was passed. Now, why? He recognizes that a rigidly male-dominated, violent, punitive, authoritarian family is a foundation, is one of the cornerstones of that kind of a state or tribe. Now, we need to connect the dots. And we are working, and I invite you and your organization to work with us on a campaign to show this link, to change the name from domestic violence, which immediately becomes marginalized. You know, because we're trained to do that, aren't we? To family violence, to coercive control, which is, there are trends in this direction, by the way. But we need to, as you said, really, Rick, we need to get the media engaged. And a member of our board of the Center for Partnership Systems, who owns a PR agency, is part of this. We're just in the process of organizing this. It's really an initiative, not just a campaign, because we realize that this is a long-term strategy, showing these links. And notice that it involves all four of the cornerstones. It involves children and families, of course. It involves women, who are typically the majority of the recipients of this violence in families. It involves economics. There are enormous economic costs of this violence in families that somehow get swept under the rug. But, and of course, story and language, the story that, well, that's just human nature, and women anyway deserve it somehow, because look at Eve, look at Pantora.
That's another story.
You know, and that's the advice that religious, women would go to their priests, for example, and they tell them, well, don't provoke it. Don't provoke it? I mean, give me a break here.
That's a pretty low bar.
It's a pretty low bar, and it's blaming the victim.
Yeah. Yep. So you were talking about the economy, and I'm just, I know you've been working quite a bit in terms of the caring and just economy. Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Sure.
Especially regarding women and their connection, and the devaluation of women and the family and all of that stuff. Because you've been working in that space for a long time, and I think it's important for people to
Well,
know
I
about
wrote
it.
a whole book about that, as you know,
Exactly.
the real wealth of nations. And yes, it's
Yes.
a play on the Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. But notice that our economic systems don't recognize the contributions of people or of nature. You know, for both Marx and for Smith, nature was just there to be exploited. There's nothing about caring for our natural life support systems. And as for the contributions of the care work that in domination systems is just relegated to women, that is really the hidden system of gendered values that I mentioned earlier, isn't it? And it is, in terms of your work, so much this us against them kind of thinking, because the model that we have is that women are naturally inferior, and that makes anything that in domination with its systems, with their rigid gender stereotypes, is coded feminine, inferior. So we've got to move to a caring economics of partnerism. And of course, we need markets. We need free markets. We don't happen to have them, and we can't in domination systems. And of course, we need government policies, but we need them to be enlightened policies. And yes, policies that we're beginning to see in many other nations, but not yet in the United States, although we're on the way, slowly, surely. Policies that reward caring for people starting at birth and caring for our natural life support systems. And unless we do this, we're going to be stuck. Because the premise of the old system, as Smith really, it's very confusing about Smith, because on the one hand, he was an ethicist. He wrote about humans really being ethical, not being completely selfish. And on the other hand, he assumed that it's pure selfishness. And that's the part of his thinking that's been blown up because he modifies it in so many ways. And I really don't want to go into that because we don't want to just modify the old story. We want to transcend it.
That makes perfect sense. So how can we get to partnership culture? And for me, it's also about expanding we power and we consciousness. So the power of partnership culture, the power of people to come together to transform our society and our world. So how are you doing that with your organization and your network?
I just wrote an article for Compass, which, as you know, is the World Futurist Organization,
Yeah.
on the difference between short-term tactics and long-term strategies.
Mm.
And it is the long-term strategies that lay foundations for a we culture. You know that trauma is built into domination systems, starting in domination-oriented families. Remember, I said from my I studied Nazi Germany quite a lot, but this is true of the Taliban. It's true of the so-called parenting guides, of so-called Christian parenting guides, which are anything but Christian. They're domination parenting guides. You frighten the child into fear of pain. Is one of the things that holds domination systems together. And starting with God-fearing and parent-fearing, these so-called Christian parenting guides traumatize children so that they learn, and they're very clear about that the parents' will is law. And that transfers then to the strongman leader. I was interviewed by the Scientific American, and you can just enter my name in Google and Scientific American, and it'll come up on this link between families and family violence and the violence of us against them. Because it isn't just one thing, that we're taught to equate difference with either dominating or being dominated, but that we're taught that violence is masculine. Now, it isn't masculine, it's cruel, and it causes pain. But as I said, a fear of pain is what holds domination systems together. But we can, as we move towards partnership systems, we can move more towards the sharing of pleasure.
Mm.
And there is great pleasure. It's not just neuroscience, but psychological studies show that when we give rather than receive, we are so much happier than when we receive. It's very strange, isn't it? And goes contrary to the old story that we're innately selfish. There seems to be something in our biology, even, that all things being equal, we would tend more towards not being us versus them, but recognizing what physics now recognizes. I mean, two guys got a Nobel Peace Prize, two guys got a Nobel Prize in physics for this non-locality finding, for this interconnection finding.
Right.
But it takes a long time for that to really filter down. And for it to really filter down, we have to connect the dots. And this is what my work has offered, frankly, a new frame. And we need to recognize the frame of those pushing us back. That is the frame of domination systems. It is an authoritarian, top-down family, economics, and society. We have to put family back in the picture. And as you move more towards partnership, whether it was eons ago in Çatalhöyük or other prehistoric societies, whether it's in some tribal societies, not all, but some tribal societies today, like the Muso of northern China, or whether it's the Nordic nations that I mentioned, we can move towards partnership, not completely violence-free, not completely ideal. I had to coin another new word, pragmatopia, instead of utopia.
That's interesting.
No place, right? Pragma means a practical place. But these all require that we recognize this configuration, that we recognize that gender is not just a women's issue. It's a key social, family, and economic organizing principle. We have to recognize that violence and abuse is built into domination systems. Because how else can you maintain or impose these rankings, these top-down rankings of domination? Ultimately, it's fear of pain, fear of violence, and of course, story and language. So we're all working in our own way. And I really appreciate the work that you're doing, Rick, to change our stories and to show that we are interconnected. But I have to say one thing here. Unless we work together on these long-term strategies, traumatized people are not going to change. They're in denial, whether it's climate change denial, whether it's election result denial, whether it's COVID-19 denial, whether it's denial that, yes, in our families, our parents caused us pain, not because they're bad, but because that's what they were taught and that's what they experienced. We have to break that cycle and we have to connect the dots.
You know, that reminds me of something like you were talking about how people's health can be enhanced when they make when they contribute to others, like in the community and in relationships and that kind of thing. Because what I was thinking about that, and I think healing trauma is connected to this. Um, one of the reasons that I started We the World back in 1998, I actually had a little booklet which I handed out to people to to ask them if they would join the governing board, and there was a a page about psychology in a sense, like people growing up in all kinds of situations, cultures, and everything, growing up with a void in their lives, which very often gets translated into people attempting to fill that void with things like addictions, like drugs or alcohol or TV or shopping, or it could be all kinds of things to fill that void. So, one of the ideas was to have a way that people could plug in and make and be of service to the people around them in their communities and ultimately the world. So that was actually one of the reasons to start with the world. And so you were talking about healing trauma, and maybe that's part of it, is being, getting out there and doing something that could help others.
Absolutely. And we humans, look, the term love is very interesting. If you look at the term love, we use it, don't we, for what gives us pleasure. We love our pets, right? Well, they give us pleasure. We love our children. Well, they give us some pleasure, sometimes grief, but we've got to change the fundamentals. And we've got to change the story, as you say. I think that this is not easy, but we've got to get the media engaged. And now, I mean, we are really at a crossroads because the domination system is beginning to reach its logical end, which is breakdown in evolution. As I pointed out years ago, it's funny, the chalice and the blade is, I mean, quite old by now, and it's even more timely. And so is sacred pleasure, which talks about sexuality and spirituality. It's the subtitle is Sex, Myth, and the Politics of the Body. We're finally beginning to catch up to the knowledge that we have, that it's in our bodies, this trauma. And it's not that easy. And that's why we have to have these long-term strategies.
And I also am very aware that, things are happening at the moment. There are conflicts around the world. People are concerned about even the state of our democracy in the United States. So I think it's both. It's like immediate and long term.
Absolutely.
You know.
Absolutely.
So do you think our democracy could actually become an embodiment of we consciousness that works for the common good?
I think
I mean,
it's
is
a
that
global
possible?
process. I think it is a global process because I'm a Holocaust survivor, and I realize that frankly, if we had not gone to war with Nazi Germany and won, I would be dead, and we would all be living in a very, very different world, the kind of world that MAGA envisions, frankly. Where those on top live very well and those on bottom, trickle down economics is such an obscene thing. I mean, think about it, trickle down, it's like in feudal times, you're to content them, people are to content themselves with the scraps falling from the opulent tables of those on top. But it's domination economics. I mean, think of ancient Chinese emperors. Think of Arab sheiks, think of Indian pashas. It's not new. And we have to really inform ourselves a little bit more. And this requires a longer attention span. I mean, it isn't just, the existential threat, of course, is climate change. And there is no way to really stop this because the conquest and domination of nature is part and parcel of domination systems. But you have to really look at the whole system. And that's what this frame is about. And as I started to say, but I somehow, being nonlinear in my thinking, veered off to another subject. Really, we must have a frame. And those people who are pushing us back, whether it's MAGA, whether it's fundamentalism of all stripes, right, with God-fearing, whether it's the Taliban, or whether it's Khomeini's Iran, or whether it was Nazi Germany, it just doesn't really matter. They have a frame. I mean, in which, yes, family plays an important role. I mean, think of the social issues that those in the United States pushing us back towards more rigid domination times, is control your children. And very rigid gender stereotypes, nothing in between, even though we've known forever that there have forever been people in between being, this stereotypical masculine or feminine. I mean, there are trends against that, but we don't have a frame. So we're all over the place. The environmental movement is here, and the spirituality movement is there, and the women's movement is here, and the just beginning rights of children movement is over there. Racism is over someplace else. And it's all of them are challenging the same thing. Traditions of domination, for goodness sakes. You'd think that we connect the dots, but even those of us who want a better world, our universities, I hope, we're more educated as a rule, although not necessarily, but even our universities fragment our consciousness. They're siloed. And gender studies just appeared. I mean, about 60 years ago. I mean, think about this for a moment. And it's still marginalized. It's someplace over there. We need to integrate, and we're working on that. And if listeners have contacts with universities, with people who are teaching, we will soon. There is a professor of global history who is using this frame, which is the only frame that makes sense in global history to really understand what in the heck is going on. But we've got to change the curriculum in our schools. And it isn't this piecemeal thing, and again, us versus them. We need to understand that the people who really believe that the domination system is the only alternative, they've been traumatized. And so we need to break that cycle. And that starts in families, as I said in my interview with the Scientific American.
Wow, that sounds good. So could you crystallize a call to action? What would you, if you wanted to engage people in making a difference in this way, what would be your call to action? What would you like people to
All right.
take action for partnership culture and, of course, for a society based on we consciousness and the common good?
Well, for us to recognize our interconnection is certainly an important step. But as you know, it is really those of us who recognize this. And we have to pay attention to the media. We have to pay attention to education. We must pay attention to families. And by the way, we have on our website, it's centerforpartnership.org, for free, a short parenting guide based on the latest neuroscience, the Caring and Connected Parenting Guide, available for free in both English and Spanish. And I'd love to see it translated into other languages, by the way.
Sounds like a great idea.
Disseminated. And you might be, your organization could perhaps do that, because people need resources. They need to change their consciousness, but it is simply not enough in this abstract way. We need to understand that this in-group versus out-group, this us against them, thinking and acting, is built into the domination systems we have inherited. We need to know that it's not the only human alternative. We need to know that actually, as I said, in a strange way, by the grace of evolution, we get actually neurochemical rewards of pleasure, not just when we care for a loved one, but even for a pet. I mean, caring is a human capacity. Men, women, everybody in between gets rewards of pleasure for it. But the question is it only caring for the in-group versus the out-group? And once we recognize that we're interconnected, of course, we do care for the out-group as well. We recognize that this shift cannot just be a small minority of us who recognize our interconnection. And that takes me back to the 4 cornerstones and to the fact that, yes, we need short-term tactics. My God, we have to put out all these fires. As far as climate change, there isn't much time. We have to, but we also have to replace the current economic system and move towards a caring economics of partnerism. And it's described in detail in my book, The Real Wealth of Nations. Again, it's described in Nurturing Our Humanity, which is the most recent book. It's not easy. It isn't going to be quick, and we're running out of time. So we've got to do both. Short-term tactics, long-term strategies.
Yes, thank you. So this has been a really wonderful conversation that we've had. Thank you, Dr. Riane Eisler, and much love to you all always. Thank you. And I want to thank all of you who are watching this for being part of our 20th anniversary of 11 Days of Global Unity. Please go to we.net to get involved and even make a contribution if you want. And as we say at the end of each of our sessions, it's all about we, right? So this is like a W. So let's go from being a me society, like this is the like an M, right? So let's go from being a me society to a we society. And that's why we launched we.net. So together we can create a world that works for all. Thank you again so much. Bye bye. Thank you.